Amber Heard, the online abuse. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Earlier this year, of course, we had the television spectacle of the Depp versus Heard defamation trial, which kept many people in business in terms of writing up what was going on a daily basis in mainstream media, blogs, and of course many people across YouTube talking about what was revealed, the various memes that were created, the memorable things such as my dog stepped on a bee, people that turned amateur lawyer and amateur detective, looking at the evidence, coming up with their own theories, looking at the evidence to determine who they believed. And of course, Johnny Depp was ultimately successful both in court and the court of public opinion. However, Amber Heard was not without her supporters. And, of course, following her defeat in court, she has largely stayed out of the public eye, something that I have touched upon in parts passum of the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp series. However, an interesting article in Stylus raises the issue of the online abuse that Amber Heard has been subjected to, and therefore it's worth examining that, but layering it against, of course, the understanding that she is a narcissist, to ask questions such as, how does this actually affect her? Why are people engaging in it? And why do people not see what she is? The article written by Lauren Gayal reads, Amber Heard, 130 feminist organisations and campaigners have signed an open letter calling out the vilification of the actor. Now, Amber Heard was, of course, subject to a tsunami of comment, both during the trial and afterwards. Some from obviously clear Depp supporters, who saw her as the personification of evil. Other people who were perhaps a little more even-handed and watched the trial and looked at the evidence and made their own minds up as to who they believed. Those believing that she was the abuser, others perhaps thinking that neither of them particularly pleasant characters, but ultimately saw that she was in the wrong. Many thought that it was a useful opportunity to allow the abuse of a man to be spoken about and to receive prominence. But it did lead to Amber Heard receiving a lot of abuse. Some would see it as justified. They would think to themselves, she's an awful human being, so I'm going to call out that behaviour. And I just don't like her, and I'm going to revel in basically kicking her while she's down. The individuals that would engage in that invariably would range from a lot of what I classify as normal people, i.e. they have emotional empathy, but it wouldn't extend to Amber Heard because they don't actually know her. And moreover, what they see in terms of her behaviour they find repulsive, so they lash out against her. Also, empathic people might also behave in a similar way because, having evaluated the evidence, their emotional empathy that exists for her has been reduced as a consequence of her abusive behaviour, although it's less likely that they would engage in repeated attacks against her, but would rather talk about how they found her behaviour unpleasant and unsavoury, rather than necessarily launching attacks against her. There'll be those that feel that perhaps as victims of abuse themselves, that they are triggered by her being an abuser towards Depp, and therefore they see her in the group of their own abuser, and perhaps driven by emotional thinking, lash out at her. There are others who simply form the view that she's game, that she's there to be attacked, and they enjoy doing so, irrespective of the fact that she is a human being, irrespective of what her feelings might be about it. There'd be many that would say, I'm not interested in that. She's an abuser, she deserves everything that she gets. Now, of course, she had many supporters thereafter, and there'll be many of you know that there appeared to be a somewhat concerted effort by certain individuals to rally behind her and indeed go on the attack against those that have been commenting adversely about her. For instance, the campaign that was embarked against Tug online, and of course Mr. Boozy having some involvement in terms of seeking out those accounts which were deemed to be engaging in this unpleasant behaviour towards her. There were other lieutenants of Amber Heard that were to be seen on Twitter supporting her and attacking other individuals. But it's interesting to note that 130 feminist organisations and campaigners have signed an open letter calling out the vilification of the actor. It'll be interesting to see, are they doing that because they believe that she is an innocent victim, that Depp was the abuser? Or are they perhaps looking at it and saying, although she was found to have lied and that she defamed him, she still does not deserve the vilification that she has received? Let's dive in and find out. And again, break it down vis-a-vis people's behaviours and the interaction with narcissism. The open letter calls out the online harassment and abuse directed at Amber Heard in the aftermath of her defamation trial against Johnny Depp. Over 130 feminist organisations and experts have signed an open letter condemning the vilification of Aquaman actor Amber Heard following the high-profile defamation trial between her and her former husband, Johnny Depp. The letter, which has been signed by organisations including Refuge and the Women's March Foundation, denounces the unprecedented vitriol directed at Heard and those who supported her before, during and after the trial, which took place in Virginia earlier this year. Much of this harassment was fueled by disinformation, misogyny, biphobia, and a monetised social media environment where a woman's allegations of domestic violence and sexual assault were mocked for entertainment. The letter reads, "The same disinformation and victim-blaming tropes are now being used against others who have alleged abuse." Well, it'll be interesting to see what the actual evidence is of that, both in terms of the categories that they've spoken about, and does it fall within that with regard to the behaviour towards her. There's no doubt that she received abuse online, that was clear. And also to what extent it is being used elsewhere. Is this accurate? Is this correct? As I always explain to you, examine the evidence. But also, the fact of this, is it that they believe that she was a victim of domestic violence? They seem to accept that, because they make reference to her making allegations of domestic violence and sexual assault. The trial, which came to an end on the 1st of June, took place after Depp accused his ex-wife of defaming him in a 2018 op-ed in the Washington Post, in which she described herself as a public figure representing domestic abuse. The article did not name Depp, but he brought the legal proceedings to clear his name. Heard countersued Depp for statements made by his former lawyer, Adam Waldman, and in the end, the jury awarded Heard $2 million and Depp $15 million, which was capped at $10.35 million. Both parties have since appealed the decision, with lawyers representing Heard describing the verdict as inherently and irreconcilably inconsistent in documents published online. However, it was beyond the walls of the courtroom on social media where the ramifications of the trial were fully felt. From TikTok clips mocking Heard's testimony to videos using fake information to discredit her claims, the vitriol aimed at the actor was unprecedented in scale and severity. In fact, in July, a report by Bot Sentinel, a non-partisan, I wouldn't really describe it as that, platform that uses AI to track harassment and tackle disinformation, found that Heard had been subjected to one of the worst cases of cyberbullying and cyberstalking by a group of Twitter accounts. The letter also commented on the impact the trial has had on discussions about domestic violence, calling out some of the damaging stereotypes which emerged as a result. In our opinion, the Depp versus Heard verdict and continued discourse around it indicate a fundamental misunderstanding of intimate partner and sexual violence and how survivors respond to it, it says. It does seem to me that they seem to be ignoring the fact that a man was subjected to domestic violence, but there we are. The damaging consequences of the spread of this misinformation are incalculable. We have grave concerns about the rising misuse of defamation suits to threaten and silence survivors. Clearly, they accept that she is the victim and that he is the aggressor, regardless of what the evidence was in court and the finding of that court. That they see that she is a survivor, and they see that the defamation suit brought by Depp was viewed as a further means of trying to silence her. Of course, as you know from my detailed examination of Heard's behaviour, I determined that she was a narcissist. And I explained why that is and how she acted as she did and why she made the allegations as she did. The article continues. The letter states, "We condemn the public shaming of Amber Heard and join in support of her. We support the ability of all to report intimate partner and sexual violence free of harassment and intimidation." Presumably they would include Johnny Depp in that. Speaking in the aftermath of the verdict earlier this year, Heard commented on the role she felt social media had played during the trial. "I don't care what one thinks about me or what judgments you want to make about what happened in the privacy of my own home in my marriage behind closed doors," Heard said. Well, actually she does, because subconsciously they're threats to her control. She said during an interview with NBC, "I don't presume the average person should know those things, so I don't take it personally. But even somebody who is sure I'm deserving of all this hate and vitriol, even if you think that I'm lying, you still couldn't look me in the eye and tell me that you think on social media there's been a fair representation. You cannot tell me that you think that this has been fair." And that's the end of the article. Now, it is interesting that so many organisations have rallied behind her. They clearly accept that she's the victim and don't accept that Depp is. They are, of course, able to form their views about that. It's their opinions. And, of course, one may form the view that what she was subjected to afterwards went too far in many instances. There'll be those that disagree and think that she deserved it because of the way that she had behaved. But what is interesting is that these organisations clearly do not accept that she is the perpetrator. They miss entirely that she, of course, is a narcissist and would engage in such behaviours and thereafter cry foul as part of her victim mentality. It just demonstrates how many of these organisations, which are involved in protecting people from domestic violence, which more often than not is going to be perpetrated by narcissists, fail to recognise one amongst them. This, of course, is often the case, but many of these organisations fail to understand that the domestic violence, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, financial, and so forth, is perpetrated by narcissists. Not an individual who had over-strict toilet training as a child, not an individual that's got anger management problems or is rampantly envious or jealous, not an individual that has self-esteem issues, but narcissists. The narcissist who looks at the world in a different way, that engages in a pattern of abusive and systemically abusive behaviours in order to assert control and nullify those threats to control, that thrives on fuel, that cannot and will not change. These organisations, well-intentioned as they are in terms of their support, invariably miss what the perpetrator is. And without that full understanding of what's being dealt with, how can they possibly advise their victims appropriately? Moreover, you have to question these organisations if they can't see that an individual that they are supporting is actually a narcissist. Now, of course, it's often the case within such organisations. There are many good empathic people that are seeking to protect individuals. But also, many of these advocates include narcissists, mid-range, because it's an excellent environment to get to the prime aims whilst maintaining a facade of being a caring and decent person. The fact is, whether it's narcissists in these organisations or non-narcissists, they appear to repeatedly miss who the perpetrators are, and have done so again in this instance, and on a rather substantial scale. It'll be interesting to see where this leads to next. They're right, in a sense, that the behaviour that she was subjected to in certain instances could be viewed as gratuitous. Of course, all it did was provide her with challenge fuel. After all, negative fuel is still good fuel for her, albeit the challenges she'll deal with and nullify them. But they fail to recognise what she is and why she would evoke such a reaction in individuals. If they understood that, they could better understand some of the reactions that come from the variety of people that engaged in the online abuse, which would also include some narcissists, but a lot of normal people, and why they don't have emotional empathy for her. And therefore it would help them understand better how to protect actual victims more effectively by identifying who is what in the dynamic with greater precision. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.